The starship Valiant moved through space toward a strange planet called Ethermore and Commander Lisa. Grant sat in her chair watching the view screen with wide eyes because what she saw made no sense at all. The planet below had cities made of crystal and silver that reached up toward two moons hanging impossibly close in the sky, and flying around those towers were dragons, and real actual dragons, with scales that reflected light from 3 different suns. Lisa had been in space for 15 years, but nothing prepared her for this moment, and she gripped her armrest tighter as the ship shook and descended through amber-colored clouds. Lieutenant Amy Brooks called out from her station that the readings were crazy, and some of the life signs below showed creatures thousands of years old, and Lisa felt her heart beat faster because they had followed a distress signal for 3 months across unknown space, and now they were finally here. The landing platform appeared beneath them like magic, and it seemed to be made of solid light, and the Valiant settled down gently, and Lisa stood up and straightened her uniform and told her team to get ready. She took Amy with her, and also Dr. Kate Morgan, who studied alien life, and pilot Danny Hill and security officer Maya Torres, and they all wore light armor with weapons ready just in case, and they stepped out onto the platform. The air felt strange and full of energy that made their scanners stop working, and they could only use their eyes now, and Lisa looked around at the impossible architecture and felt very small. Then a voice spoke, and it was beautiful and powerful and made Lisa feel like she was hearing music, and the voice said, "Welcome, wanderers of the void." A woman appeared between columns of light, and she was the most beautiful being Lisa had ever seen, and her skin glowed like moonlight, and her hair was silver and dark blue, and fell down her back in waves, and her eyes burned like dying stars. The woman wore armor that looked like it had been grown instead of made, and it had dragon scales mixed with living vines that glowed softly, and she stood tall and proud and radiated power. The woman said she was Queen Lyra of the Starborn Elves, and beside her something huge appeared that made Danny gasp and stumble backward in fear. The dragon was as big as a fighter jet, and its scales changed colors that humans had no names for, and it looked at them with intelligence that felt almost human, and when it spoke, its voice was like thunder in their chests. The dragon said its name was Ember, and that it had been bonded to Lyra since the first dawn of this world, and they were grateful that someone had answered their call, but also suspicious. Lisa forced herself to step forward, even though every instinct told her to run away, and she looked into the queen's eyes and said they had received the distress signal and came to help. Something changed in Lyra's face, and maybe was surprise or pain, and she said the distress signal was sent long ago when enemy ships first appeared, and that was 2,000 years ago by human counting, and she asked why it took so long for them to arrive. Lisa's mind raced because 2,000 years made no sense, and the signal they received was only 3 months old, and it sounded urgent and recent. Dr. Kate Morgan spoke up, and her voice was steady despite her obvious fear, and she said they only got the signal 3 months ago, and it talked about an invasion and about the world being overrun by something called the Void Swarm, and she asked if that threat had existed for 2,000 years. Lyra looked at Ember, and the dragon narrowed his eyes, and Lyra confirmed that the Void Swarm arrived 20 centuries ago from beyond normal space, and they were creatures of pure hunger and evil, and for 2,000 years, the elves had fought them. Alone, Lyra's voice grew harder as she spoke, and she said they had held the line and prevented the swarm from spreading to other worlds, and for 2,000 years, they fought without help from anyone. Amy stepped forward to ask about the signal, but Ember interrupted, and smoke came from his nostrils, and he said the signal was sent when their defenses first fell, and when the previous queen died in battle, and when they thought they would lose everything, but they adapted and survived and learned to fight creatures that existed partially outside reality itself. Lisa felt the weight of what they were hearing, and this was not a rescue mission anymore, and this was first contact with people who had been fighting a war longer than some human countries had existed. Lyra stared directly at Lisa and asked why she avoided the question, and said she sensed hesitation, and asked if it was her appearance or her power or the knowledge that the elves had suffered while humans stayed safe in their corner of space. The question felt pointed and almost accusatory, but there was something vulnerable beneath it, and Lisa opened her mouth to explain that she was just processing everything and trying to understand, but before she could speak, alarms blared across the city, and dragons took flight in huge groups, and their riders mounted up with practiced speed, and the sky itself seemed to tear open. Through the tears came things that hurt to look at, and they were creatures made of shadow and teeth, and beings that seemed to exist in multiple places at once, and ships that moved in ways that broke the laws of physics. Lyra said coldly that it was the Void Swarm, and they had sensed the human arrival, and they were hungry for new worlds to consume. And she said, "Welcome to Ermor." And now the humans would see what the elves had fought for 2,000 years. Roared, and the sound shook the platform, and Lisa watched as Queen Lyra jumped onto the dragon back with grace that seemed impossible, and they took flight together, moving as one. Being Maya put her hand on her weapon and asked what their orders were. Lisa watched the queen disappear into the chaos of the sky, leading her forces against horrors from beyond reality, and she thought about the question Lyra had asked, and the hurt beneath the accusation. Why do you avoid me and not avoid them? But avoid me specifically, Lisa said firmly, that they would fight because they came to help, and that was exactly what they were going to do. And she told her team to get back to the ship and arm everything they had. She said if the elves had been holding the line for 2,000 years, then the least humans could do was stand with them for one day. As her team ran back to the valiant, Lisa looked up at the battle in the impossible sky, and she had a feeling that the queen question went deeper than she understood, and that before this war was over, she would need to find an answer. The real question was whether she would survive long enough to give it. And as the ship weapons powered up and the sky filled with fire and shadow, Lisa felt something change inside her. She had come here to answer a distress call, but now she realized she had found something else, and something that made her want to fight harder than she ever had before. And as the first wave of Void Swarm creatures approached, the valiant Lisa smiled grimly and prepared for battle. War had found them, and now they would show these ancient elves what humans were made of. The valiant weapons came alive with power, and Lisa crew took their positions at their stations, and through the view screen the sky was a nightmare of twisting shadows and blazing dragon fire. The Void Swarm moved like living darkness, and their forms were unstable, and they flickered between different realities, and they descended on the crystal towers of Ethermore like a plague. Amy shouted over the alarms that target lock was impossible because these things did not stay in one reality long enough for the systems to track them. Lisa told her to fire where they were going to be and not where they were, and to find their pattern and figure out their rhythm. Kate Morgan worked at another console, and her fingers moved fast across the displays, and she said she was detecting something interesting, and the elves were not just fighting, but synchronizing with their dragons. It was like a mind link, but biological, and they were predicting the swarm movements through some kind of shared awareness. Lisa asked if they could tap into it, and Kate said not without equipment they did not have, but she could try to copy their attack pattern and feed it to the targeting system. A massive explosion rocked the Valiant as one of the shadow creatures appeared inside their shields, and Maya was already moving with her rifle firing, but the creature absorbed the energy like it was food. Maya yelled that regular weapons were useless, and she dove behind cover as the thing attacked with limbs that existed in too many directions at once. Then Ember was there, and he smashed through the hull with controlled force, and the dragon claws tore into the void creature. But it was not the physical attack that killed it. It was the fire from Ember mouth and flames that seemed to force the creature to stay in reality before burning it to nothing. Queen Lyra sat on the dragon, and her armor glowed with combat power, and she looked at Lisa through the torn hull, and for a moment their eyes met, and there was a question in that look before Lyra turned Ember back to the main battle. Danny asked if she'd just saved them, and Lisa confirmed that she did, and said something was clicking in her mind, and she told Kate to analyze those flames. Kate fingers danced across her console, and she said the fire was not normal fire, but a form of energy that forced the Void Swarm to exist fully in their reality and made them vulnerable. Kate said this was amazing, and if they could copy it, then Lisa interrupted and said they could not copy it, but they could support those who could, and she told Amy to redirect all power to shields and protect the dragon riders. Dragon Riders Amy pointed out that would leave them defenseless, and Lisa said no, that made them useful because they were the shield and the dragons were the sword. The battle went on for hours, and the Valiant became a moving fortress in its shields, created safe areas where wounded dragons could recover and where elven warriors could regroup. Lisa coordinated their movements with hand signals and basic displays because they could not talk directly, but she was learning to read the flow of Battleland. Through it all, she kept seeing Lyra, and the Queen was everywhere at once, commanding her forces, with brilliant tactics and fighting with deadly grace. But always, she seemed to be looking toward the Valiant and toward Lisa. When the last of the Void Swarm pulled back through their rifts, the sky slowly cleared, and the damage was bad, with 3 towers fallen and dozens of dragons wounded, and the Valiant was down to 40% power. Lyra landed Ember on what was left of the Valiant landing platform, and she got off the dragon with visible exhaustion, and her armor was cracked and bleeding light from wounds, but she walked toward Lisa with purpose. Lyra said they fought well, and most species ran when they first saw the swarm, and some tried to fight and were killed within minutes, but the humans adapted and understood what was needed. Lisa nodded and wiped soot from her face and started to say they needed to talk, but Lyra interrupted and asked why she avoided her. Lyra said she saw how Lisa looked at her when they first met, and not with the fear the other humans showed, and not with awe or political calculation. But Lisa looked at her and then looked away, as if seeing her caused pain. Lisa was surprised by how direct this was and started to speak, but Lyra said to call her by her name. When they spoke of this and not use titles, Lyra said she had been a queen for 15 centuries and had talked with beings of pure energy and traded knowledge with machine gods, but she had never met someone who made her feel uncertain of herself. Lisa crew had moved away to give them privacy, and even Ember had withdrawn, though the dragons still watched from a distance. Lisa said carefully that she did not look away because of Lyra, but because she was trying to process what she was feeling, and she said Lyra was overwhelming. Lyra's eyes widened, and she asked what that meant. Lisa admitted that Lyra was overwhelming in every way, and she was beautiful in a way that made poets seem weak, and she was powerful enough to make strong warriors feel like children, and she had been fighting to protect worlds that did not even know she existed. Lisa asked how she was supposed to look at that and not feel insufficient for. A long moment Lyra just stared at her, and then the Queen laughed, and it was a sound like bells and thunder mixed together. Lyra asked how Lisa could feel insufficient when she had commanded her ship to become a shield for warriors not her own, and who learned to fight an unknown enemy in hours, and who stood firm while reality was torn apart. Lyra stepped closer, and Lisa held her ground despite instinct telling her to back away, and Lyra said she asked the question because she felt something she had not felt in centuries. She felt interest and connection, and when she looked at Lisa, she saw someone who understood the weight of command and the burden of protecting others, and she saw someone who might understand her. Lisa said quietly that she was human and would live maybe a century, while Lyra had already lived 15 times that. And what kind of connection could there be? Lyra replied that it was the kind that mattered, and the kind not measured in years but in understanding. And she asked Lisa why she really came when she heard the signal. Lisa thought about the haunting song that had drawn them across the stars and said because someone was calling for help and she could not ignore it. Isla asked if she would have come. She knew the signal was 2,000 years old. Lisa said yes. Without hesitation, Isla asked why. Lisa said because Lyra needed help 2,000 years ago, and no one came, and that was still a debt that should be paid. Lyra smiled, and it changed her face from something otherworldly to something Lisa could almost relate to. And she said that was why she wanted to know Lisa better. That was why she asked, because in 2,000 years many species had passed through, and most ran, and some joined briefly, and none stayed, and none none stayed, and none cared about a debt older than their civilizations. An alarm sounded. An Amy voice came through, saying they were detecting another wave forming, and it was bigger than the last and would arrive in 20 minutes. Lisa and Lyra looked at each other, and something passed between them, and it was understanding and respect, and the beginning of something neither could name yet. Lyra asked if Lisa would fight beside them again. Lisa said they came to help, and that had not changed, but after this battle, if they survived, she wanted to understand, and she wanted to know about the war and about the Elven people and about how they held the line so long. She said she wanted to know. Lyra herself, the queen's smile grew wider, and she said she wanted to know. Lisa too, and wanted to understand the species that sent a single ship to answer a call 2,000 years old. But first they had a battle to win. Lyra turned to leave and to mount Ember again, but she paused and said that Lisa should stop avoiding her gaze because she found she quite liked it when Lisa looked at her before Lisa could respond. Lyra was gone and soaring into the sky on Dragonback and rallying her forces for the next fight. Lisa stood on the damaged deck with her crew moving around her in organized chaos and preparing for battle. Amy called asking for orders. Lisa watched Lyra command her forces in the distance and watched the coordination between dragon and rider and watched a queen who had fought for 2,000 years lead her people once more. Lisa said they would do what they came to do, and they would fight. And when this was over, they would find a way to end this war, not just for today, but forever. Donnie said that was ambitious. Lisa replied that answering a 2,000-year-old distress signal was also ambitious, and they were already committed, so they might as well commit fully as. The next wave of Void Swarm began tearing through reality. Lisa realized something important. Iriah did not ask why Lisa avoided looking at her because of pride or offense, but because after 2,000 years of war, she had finally found someone who saw her not as a symbol or weapon, but as a person, and Lisa, despite how impossible it all was, had begun to see Lyra the same way. The battle ahead would be brutal, but for the first time since arriving, Lisa felt they were fighting for something more than survival. They were fighting for understanding and for connection, and perhaps for something that neither human nor elf had words for yet. The second wave was much worse than the first, and the Void Swarm came in numbers that blocked out all three suns in their reality-bending forms. Created storms of impossible things across the sky. Lisa commanded the Valiant through what felt like the longest 6 hours of her life, and even as exhaustion hit her crew hard, she noticed something strange. That elves were tired, and not just from this battle, but from a deep weariness that went into their bones, and she saw it in how some dragon riders hesitated too long, and how their formations had gaps that should not exist in a force with 2,000 years of practice. When the swarm finally pulled back, Lisa made a choice, and she told Amy to take command of the ship, and told Kate and Maya and Danny to come with her. Kate asked where they were going, and Lisa said to get answers. They found Lyra in what looked like a war room, but was more alive than any human military building, and the walls were made of living crystal that showed tactical information through glowing patterns. Lyra stood before a map of the sector, and Ember was coiled around a platform nearby, with his huge head resting on his closet. Queen looked up as they entered, and her armor was off, showing simple clothes beneath, and without the royal gear, she looked younger somehow, and more tired. Lyra greeted them and said she assumed they were here for the conversation they had delayed. Lisa said directly that something did not make sense, and she said Lyra had technology that made human tech look primitive, and had dragons that could control reality, and had warriors who had been fighting longer than human civilization existed. So Lisa asked why they were losing. Kate winced at the bluntness, but Lyra just nodded slowly, like she had been waiting for someone to ask. Lyra said simply that they were dying, and not in battle, and not directly, but dying of time itself. Miss Fenber lifted his head, and his ancient eyes looked at the humans, and he said the Starborn elves were created, not born or evolved, but made by beings called the First Architects. They were made to be guardians and eternal watchers of the barriers between dimensions, but even crafted immortality had limits. Slara walked to a window looking out over her damaged city, and she said they did not age like humans and could live for tens of thousands of years, but they could not have children. Isleon, elven child, was born maybe once every 5 centuries, and the process was hard and dangerous. And when the Void Swarm first arrived, they numbered in the millions, and now her voice broke, and now they were less than 10,000. Kate breathed out in understanding and said it was 2,000 years of slow losses, and they were not just fighting a war, but fighting their own extinction. Lyra confirmed this was true, and said the dragons were similar, and Ember was one of the oldest and most of the bonded. Dragons were young by their standards and barely a few centuries old, the ancient dragons. With real power to hurt the swarm had fallen long ago, and they were training new bonds as fast as they could, but it took decades for a dragon to grow strong enough to fight. And they did not have decades anymore, Maya spoke up, asking why they did. Not ask for help, and if they sent a signal 2,000 years ago, why not send another? And keep calling. Lyra turned back to them, and Lisa saw something in her eyes she'd never expected to see in an immortal queen, and it was shame, Member said quietly. That they did keep calling, and for the first 5 centuries, they sent signals constantly, and 6 species answered. 3 ran away immediately, and 2 stayed to fight, and were destroyed within a year, and the last species, called the Kethrans, stayed. For a century, they learned to fight the swarm and became good at it, but then they saw what it cost them with their own numbers falling and their civilization threatened, and they made the logical choice, and left. Lyra continued, saying that they stopped calling because the swarm influence went beyond physical danger, and they corrupted and infected and spread like sickness through the minds of those who fought them too long. They realized they were not just asking species to help, but asking them to sacrifice themselves and asking them to join their extinction. Elisa felt something cold in her stomach and asked about the signal they received. Lyra admitted it was automatic, and a beacon that turned on whenever a new species got faster than light travel within range, and it was meant to warn and give them a chance to run before they met the swarm. Lyra said she never thought anyone would actually come to help and not. And Emor Danny stepped forward, saying that was crazy, because the elves had been protecting the entire sector, and if they fell, then what? Ember stated flatly that if they fell, the swarm would spread and consume world after world, including Earth, and they estimated the swarm would reach human space within 2 centuries of the elven defeat, but that was 2 centuries for humans to prepare and develop defenses and evacuate, and the logical choice was to let the elves fall while humanity prepared. Maya said angrily, that was the most heartless logic she ever heard. Lyra replied without heat that it was survival, and she did not blame the species that left, and she understood them because this was not their war, and the elves were made for this purpose, but other species were not less looked at. The tactical display, and at the numbers that told the story, Lyra was too proud to say directly, and the elves were losing ground slowly and inevitably being pushed back another century, maybe 2, and they would fall completely. Lisa asked suddenly. Why? Lyra really asked her why she avoided her, and it was not just about personal connection, was it? Lyra met her eyes, and Lisa saw the weight of 15 centuries in that gaze, and Lyra said she wanted to know if there was something in Lisa and in her species that was different, if there was a reason to hope that this time would be different, and that this time someone would stay. Lisa asked what happened when she looked away. Lyra admitted softly that she thought she had her answer, and she thought she saw that same calculation in Lisa's eyes that she had seen in so many others before the moment they realized what staying would cost. Lisa stepped forward until she was close enough to see the faint lines of exhaustion around Lyra's eyes, and the almost invisible scars on her hands from holding weapons for centuries. Lisa said Lyra was wrong. Lyra asked if she was. Lisa said she looked away because she was terrified, and not of Lyra and not of the swarm, but terrified that she had found something worth fighting for and would not be strong enough to see it through. She was terrified that she would look at Lyra and want to stay and want to help and want to matter to her, and she knew that the moment she admitted that to herself, she could not leave, no matter how logical it would be. Our breath caught audibly, and she started to say Lisa's name, but Lisa shifted to tactical mode and asked how many troops Lyra could gather, and how many dragons and how much territory could they defend. Lyra seemed confused by the sudden change and asked what Lisa meant. Lisa said to answer the question, and if Lyra had support, real support, how long could they hold him? Her eyes brightened with something that might be hope, and he said with their current strength and outside support, they could hold indefinitely. Swarm was not infinite, and they raided from beyond dimensional barriers, but those raids were limited by how much reality they could break through at once, and with enough defenders. They could turn this from a war of slow loss into a stalemate. Kate jumped in, asking what if they found a way to close those barriers, and she said Lyra mentioned being created by the first architects to guard dimensional barriers. So did they know how to seal them. Lyra exchanged a look with Ember and said in theory, yes, but the energy needed would be huge, and it would take the combined life force of thousands of their people, and they simply did not have those numbers anymore. Kate pressed on, saying maybe they did not need life force and maybe they needed raw energy, and humans had fusion reactors and antimatter generators and quantum batteries. They had an entire civilization worth of power generation that developed separately from the elven magical approach. And what if they could combine human technology with elven knowledge? For the first time since Lisa met her, Lyra looked truly shocked, and she said she never considered that life force requirement came from the nature of barrier sealing, and it needed consciousness to bind dimensional reality. But if human machines could generate equal energy, and the elves could direct it through their ritual systems, then maybe it could work. Ember finished, saying it might actually work, and his voice rumbled with excitement. Danny pointed out that this assumed humanity would commit to the war, and Lisa could not make that choice alone, and this would need fleet resources and maybe thousands of people and years of fighting. Lisa agreed she could not make that decision, but she could make a recommendation, and she could stay here with the Valiant and any crew who wanted to volunteer while the decision was being made. They could. By time Lyra asked why, and Lisa heard the real question behind it, about why risk everything for people you just met. Lisa stepped even closer until there was barely space between them, and she said because when she looked at Lyra, she did not see someone who had been fighting for 2,000 years. She saw someone who had been protecting people who would never know her name, and she saw someone who sent away species to save them rather than chain them to a losing war. She saw someone who earned the right to not fight alone anymore. Lisa reached out and took Lyra's hand, feeling the warmth of it and the rough spots from weapons and the slight shake that showed the Queen exhaustion. 3 weeks had passed since that talk in the war room, and Lisa was beginning to understand the true size of what they were fighting against. The Valiant had become a permanent part of a Thermore defensive system, and her crew had learned so much about both the Swarm and their elven friends in ways that would change human science forever. Dark Kate Morgan had barely slept and spent every moment studying the dimensional mechanics of both Dragonfire and Void Swarm attacks, and the breakthrough came on what Lisa called Tuesday, though. Ithermore 3-sun cycle made Earth calendars meaningless. Kate burst into the command center where Lisa was looking at defensive positions with Lyra, and the Queen had started working aboard the Valiant, claiming it was more efficient than flying between locations. Lisa suspected the real reason was simpler, but neither of them had talked about it directly, yet Kate announced excitedly that she got it, and she had found the answer. Lisa looked up from the holographic display and asked what she got. Kate said the connection and the reason. Dragonfire worked when human weapons did not, and she pulled up a bunch of data on another screen. The Void Swarm existed partially in dimensional subspace, and they flickered between realities, making them nearly impossible to target. But Dragonfire did not just burn, but anchored them, temporarily forced dimensional frequencies to match, and made the Swarm exist fully in their reality. Lena leaned forward with interest and said they always knew this by feeling, but never understood how it worked. Kate explained excitedly that it was because the elves were looking at it through a magical view, but it was not magic at all. It was quantum dimensional control at a biological level, and the dragons were living quantum computers, and their brains could calculate dimensional frequencies in real time. When they breathed fire, they were basically solving an equation that forced dimensional alignment. Lisa asked if they could copy it and saw where this was going. Kate said with a grin that they could do better and they could make it stronger, and she had been working with Ember and 3 younger dragons if they could create a field using human quantum processors to mirror the dragon biological calculations. They could extend the anchoring effect across a much wider area. Instead of individual dragons anchoring individual enemies, they could anchor entire swarm formations at once. Lyra stood up fast and her eyes went wide, and she said that would change everything, because if they could force the swarm to stay in their reality, then regular weapons would work, and their numbers would actually matter. Kate continued, saying there was more, and she remembered those dimensional barriers Lyra mentioned and the ones the first architects created, and she thought she found them. They were not physical walls, but quantum frequency barriers, and the swarm was not breaking through them but finding natural weak points like cracks in armor. If they could map those weak points, then they could reinforce them. Lyra finished the thought, saying, by the architects, this was amazing, and Kate had done in 3 weeks what elven scholars could not do in 2000. Yerskate blushed slightly and said she had an advantage with fresh perspective and different technology, plus Ember was very patient with her questions. If hearing his name, the great dragon voice rumbled through the ship communication system, saying that Lisa and Lyra needed to see something immediately. They rushed to the observation deck, where Ember had positioned himself, and his huge form somehow fit into the space through dimensional tricks that Lisa was starting to understand were normal for the ancient dragon. He was staring at a holographic display showing the sector dimensional topology. Lisa asked what they were looking at. Ember explained it was the swarm attack pattern over the past 2 weeks, and they had been testing defenses more often and trying different entry points, and he thought they were searching for weaknesses, but when he looked at the pattern, he saw something else. He changed the display to show the attack vectors in order, and Lisa felt her blood run cold because the attacks were not random at all. They formed a spiral pattern, and each one was slightly closer to a specific point in space. Lyra said quietly that they were searching for something. Ember corrected, grimly saying not searching but preparing, and this was a ritual pattern, and he had seen it before at the beginning of the war. They were preparing to open a permanent portal. Lisa asked how bad that was. Lyra explained that the initial invasion used temporary rifts that could only stay open for hours at most, and that limited the number of swarm entities that could cross over. A permanent portal would allow unlimited access, and the swarm could flood through in numbers they had never seen before. Lisa demanded to know when Ember calculations appeared on the screen showing approximately 4 days, and when all 3 suns aligned, the dimensional barriers would be at their weakest. And that was when the swarm would complete the ritual. Lisa looked at Kate and asked if her resonance field could stop this. Kate admitted not yet, and they needed at least 2 weeks to build the equipment and run tests, and even then she was not sure it would be enough to close a permanent portal. They would need something bigger, Lyra said suddenly, that they could use the barrier seal, and if they could not stop the portal from opening, they could seal it shut immediately after trap whatever came through on their side and cut off reinforcements. Lisa reminded her that would require thousands of elven life force. Kate jumped in, saying or equivalent energy, and if they redirected the valiant entire reactor output through a properly set up ritual system, it might be enough. It would burn out every system they had, but it might work. Lisa felt the weight of the choice and sacrifice the valiant and potentially strand her crew on. Ethamore forever for a chance to win a war that was not technically humanity. She looked at Lyra, who was watching her with a carefully neutral expression, and clearly refusing to influence the choice. Lisa asked how many elves would survive if they did nothing. Ember answered honestly, saying a few hundred, and they would retreat to their deepest shelters and seal themselves away. And by maybe another century, but the sector would fall. Lisa asked about humanity's chances of surviving when the swarm reached them. Lyra admitted they were better than most species, because humans were clever and adaptive and resourceful, and they might hold for a generation. Maybe 2, but at great cost. Lisa nodded slowly, then opened a communication channel and said, "Attention all valiant crew, this is Commander Grant," and she was calling a vote no command decision and no orders, but just a choice, and they all knew the situation, and they could sacrifice the ship to seal the portal and potentially end the war, but strand themselves here. They could retreat and report back and let Earth Command make the decision with full resources, and they had 1 hour to register their vote. She closed the channel and found Lyra staring at her in shock, asking if she was letting them choose. Lisa said they were not soldiers, but explorers and scientists and volunteers, and this was not a chain of command decision, but a moral choice, and everyone got a say. The hour moved slowly, and Lisa spent it walking the ship and talking with crew members and listening to their fears and hopes. Some wanted to leave, and she understood that, and some wanted to stay, and she understood that too. When the time came, she gathered in the mess hall with all 43 crew members. Amy stood to announce the results, saying the vote was in, and 41 chose to stay, and 2 chose to leave. Lifla blinked in surprise and asked who the 2 Whammy confirmed it was Henderson and Bryce from engineering, and they had families back home with kids. Lisa nodded immediately, saying they would drop them at the nearest human outpost before they began, and no judgment and no questions, and she asked if anyone else wanted to reconsider. No one moved. Lisa said all right then, and told them to figure out how to save a galaxy over. The next 3 days the Valiant transformed completely, and Kate and the Elven scholars worked without stopping, and converted the human ship into a massive energy channel. Lyra coordinated defensive positions and prepared for the battle that would come when the portal opened. And in quiet moments, when planning was done and the ship was dim during sleep cycle, Lisa and Lyra found themselves drawn together. They stood on the observation deck watching Ethermore 3's suns slowly moving toward alignment. Lyra said quietly that she had not thanked Lisa for staying and for believing this war was worth fighting. Lisa replied that she had not thanked Lyra for fighting it alone for so long and for holding the line until humans got here. Lyra turned to face her, and Lisa was struck again by the weight of years in those eyes, and Lyra said she had lived 15 centuries and seen civilizations rise and fall and loved and lost more than most beings could survive. In 3 weeks, Lisa had made her feel something she thought she had forgotten. Lisa asked softly what that was. Lyra said, simply hope and also fear, because now she had something to lose again, and someone to lose. Lisa reached out, taking Lyra's hand, and said the feeling was mutual, and she came here to answer a distress call and did not expect to find someone worth everything this was going to cost. Lyra pointed out they might die in 4 days. Lisa agreed they might, but they would die fighting for something that mattered and together. And that was more than most people got. Lyra pulled her close, and Lisa let herself be held by someone who could remember when humanity was still learning to make fire, and it should have been scary, but instead it felt like coming home. The alarms that broke the peace were different from anything Lisa had heard before, and they were not electronic warnings, but something deeper and more basic. It was a sound that Ember explained was reality itself screaming as it was being torn apart. The Void Swarm ritual had started ahead of schedule, and the sky above Ethermore changed into a nightmare, and the 3 suns, not yet fully aligned, strained against forces that pulled at their orbits. The dimensional barriers that had held for thousands of years were tearing like paper. Lisa shouted for all hands to stations and ran to the bridge with Lyra beside her, and she asked Kate how long until they could activate. The sealed R. Morgan face appeared on the communication screen, covered in sweat and exhaustion, and she said the ritual framework was ready, but if they did this now without the full sun alignment, the energy drain would be huge. They might not survive it. Lisa asked what would happen if they did not do it now. Kate said the portal would stabilize fully, and the framework they built would not be enough to seal it. Lisa looked at Lyra and saw the same thinking running behind those ancient eyes, and Lisa said they would do it now. She asked Ember if his people could buy them the time they needed. The great dragon roar shook the ship, and he said every dragon on Ithamore would answer this call, and he said it had been an honor to fly with both Lisa and Lyra through the view screen. Lisa watched as hundreds of dragons took flight, and every adult and every young one old enough to breathe fire, and every elder who thought their fighting days were done. They formed a living shield between the growing portal and the Valiant, and their scales reflected the twisted light of breaking reality. The portal itself was a wound in space, and a tear that bled darkness and screamed with voices from beyond, and through it the Void Swarm was already coming. Not the small groups they had fought before, but the true invasion force, and creatures that hurt to look at, and beings that existed in too many dimensions at once, and ships made of solid death. Kate announced they were engaging the resonance field, and the Valiant hummed with power as its reactor output was sent through the ritual framework. The elves had spent 3 days installing blue-white energy began to pulse through crystal pipes that had been grown throughout the ship and turned the entire vessel into a living spell. The effect was immediate, and the anchoring field went outward in a sphere that covered half the battlefield. And Void Swarm entities caught in it suddenly became solid and fully real and vulnerable. The elven dragons fell on them like falling stars, and their fire was now devastating against enemies that could not phase between dimensions. Ami shouted from tactical that it was working, and casualties were dropping by 70% in the affected area, but the portal kept growing, and for every swarm entity the elves destroyed, 10 more came through, and the ritual the swarm had begun was feeding on itself, and reality was collapsing inward toward that dimensional wound, Lyra said quietly and pointed at the tactical display, and the portal expansion had a pattern and a spiral that was rotating toward a specific point in space. Lisa realized it was not random. Lyra confirmed grimly that they were aiming at the planet core, and if they broke through, if their more dimensional foundation, the entire world would become a permanent portal. The swarm would not just have access to this sector, but would have a position that could never be closed. Lisa demanded to know how long until they reached the Korumbar. Voice came through, strained with effort, as he fought, saying 17 minutes. And after that sealing, the portal became impossible. Lisa looked at the ship's status, and the reactor was already running at 120%, and the crystal pipes were glowing white hot. She asked Kate if they could speed up the seal. Kate replied not without burning out the reactor and killing everyone aboard, and she said they needed the full ritual sequence, and it took 20 minutes minimum. Lisa said then they needed to find a way to slow the portal expansion, and she opened communication to all frequencies. She announced this was Commander Lisa Grant of the Valiant to all forces, and they needed to physically block the portal expansion, and told everyone to form up on her. Lyra asked with alarm what Lisa was planning. Lisa admitted something incredibly stupid, and she turned to Amy and told her to move all shield power to forward projection and concentrate it into the narrowest beam they could manage. Understanding showed on Amy's face, and she said if they flew into the portal with shields set up like that, then Lisa finished saying they would be a dimensional stake. They would physically disrupt the expansion, and by Kate the time she needed. Lyra said flatly that was suicide, and the moment they entered that portal, the swarm would tear them apart. Lisa countered, saying not if they had dragons flying cover, and she said she needed Lyra to coordinate the aerial defense ember, and the elders could protect them long enough for Kate to complete the seal. Lyra said no with absolute authority and said she would not let Lisa do this. Lisa interrupted gently, saying Lyra did not have a choice, and this was what they came here to do, and save the sector and end the war, and sometimes that meant making the hard call. For a moment, immortal queen and human commander stood locked in a silent battle, and then Lyra's shoulders dropped, and she said Lisa was asking her to watch her. Lisa replied she was asking Lyra to trust her and to be ready to seal that portal the moment they had bought enough time. She turned to her crew and said everyone except essential flight crew should evacuate to the Elven City, because this was going to get rough. Maya said with respect that they voted to stay, and that vote still stood around the bridge. Her crew nodded in agreement, and Lisa felt her throat tighten but did not argue. Because they had made their choice, Lisa said all right then, and told them to go poke a hole in reality. The Valiant turned toward the portal with its shields changed into a brilliant spear of blue energy, and behind them Ember rallied every dragon within range. The Ancient Ones and scarred veterans of 2,000 years took formation around the human ship, and their fire would be the shield, and the Valiant would be the blade. As they got closer to the portal, Lisa felt reality itself begin to strain, and the ship shook, and alarm screamed as they entered the dimensional distortion field. Through the view screen, she could see things that her mind could not understand, in spaces that were both inside and outside, in moments that existed before and after themselves, in colors that had no names. Ami reported through gritted teeth that shields were holding, but they were taking dimensional fracture damage, and whole integrity was dropping. Lisa commanded to keep them steady and told Kate to start the seal sequence from deeper in the ship. She heard Kate's voice begin the ritual chant and human words mixed with ancient Elven phrases that had been taught to her by Lyra. Scholars, the valiant reactor output climbed higher to 130% and then 140. Hit the portal edge and reality screamed the void swarm. Fell on them like a wave of living darkness, but ember. And his kind were there, and ancient dragons, whose names had been spoken in legend across a dozen worlds there. Fire was not just flame, but concentrated star energy in reality, itself made into a weapon against beings that tried to unmake it. Elisa watched in awe as Ember did moves that should not be possible in his body folded through dimensions as he protected the valiant from attacks coming from impossible angles around him. The other dragons fought with the fury of beings who had spent 2,000 years holding the line and refused to fall. Nami announced that portal expansion, it was slowing and they were doing it, but the cost was horrible. And Lisa watched as dragon after dragon fell and their bodies were torn apart by concentrated swarm attacks. The Elven riders did not scream, but sang war songs that had been passed down for thousands of years and stayed defiant to the last gate. Reported 8 minutes until seal completion, but the reactor could not maintain this output much longer. Lisa looked at the readings, and they had maybe 9 minutes before a total failure, and she said they just needed to hold a little longer then. Lyra was there, and not through communication, but physically. And having flown to the ship on another dragon, she burst onto the bridge, and her armor glowed with combat damage. And her eyes were wild, and she said Lisa was going to die here with all her crew, and she could not and would not accept that. Lisa interrupted, gently saying, Lyra, this was the only. Lyra said no, fiercely, and there was another option, and the seal did not need the reactor, and it needed consciousness and awareness. That was what she tried to say before, and the first architects designed it to run on life force because machines did not have the dimensional awareness to direct the energy properly. Asked if she was saying what it sounded like, Lyra said she could complete the seal herself, and she had 15 centuries of dimensional awareness, and trained by the first architects themselves, she could direct the reactor output through her own consciousness and use herself as the focusing lens. Lisa felt ice in her blood and said that would kill Lyra. Admitted perhaps, or perhaps it would transform her and the first architects, bound their consciousness into the barriers themselves, and she might simply become part of the dimensional framework and be eternal and aware, Lisa said. Desperately, that was not living, Lyra agreed. It was not, but it was not dying either, and it saved everyone, including her people and Lisa. People in every world the swarm would have consumed.